Imagine the howling winds of a Scandinavian winter, temperatures dropping to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and darkness stretching for months on end. Now imagine surviving this with nothing but wool, wood, and centuries-old wisdom. Tonight, we're diving deep into the methodical, practical world of Viking winter survival. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the steady rhythm of ancient knowledge guide you into peaceful rest. This is Boring History for Sleep, where historical facts flow like a gentle stream, washing away the stress of your day. Tonight's journey takes us to the frozen fjords of medieval Scandinavia, where survival wasn't just a skill, it was an art form passed down through generations. Main content. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Warmth. The Vikings understood something fundamental about winter survival that modern people often overlook. Heat conservation begins with architecture. Their longhouses weren't just buildings. They were carefully engineered survival systems designed to trap and circulate warmth through the harshest months of the year. Picture a typical Viking longhouse, 30 to 60 feet in length. These structures were built partially underground, with thick walls made of stone, wood and turf. The floors were dug down several feet below ground level, taking advantage of the Earth's natural insulation property. The deeper you go into the ground, the more stable the temperature becomes, hovering around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the surface world freezes solid. The walls themselves were marvels of practical engineering. Vikings would stack stones for the foundation, then build wooden frames filled with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. This might sound primitive, but this combination created an incredibly effective insulation system. The organic materials formed tiny air pockets that trapped heat, while the clay provided moisture barriers that prevented dampness, one of the greatest enemies of winter survival. The roof was perhaps the most ingenious part. Layers of birch bark were laid over wooden planks, then covered with thick layers of turf and grass. This living roof provided exceptional insulation, while also helping to camouflage the structure in the landscape. During summer, grass and wildflowers would grow on these roofs, creating additional insulation for the following winter. Inside the longhouse, the central hearth was positioned strategically. The fire pit ran down the middle of the main room, with raised sleeping platforms along the wall. Hot air rises, so the Vikings built their sleeping areas slightly above floor level, creating natural warm zones where families would cluster during the coldest nights. The genius of this design becomes clear when you consider air. Small holes near the roof peak allowed smoke to escape while preventing heat loss. The Vikings had learned to create a gentle circulation system that kept fresh air moving without creating drafts that would steal precious water. Viking winter clothing was a sophisticated layering system that modern outdoor enthusiasts still emulate today. They understood that survival in extreme cold required multiple barriers between skin and environment, with each layer serving a specific purpose. The base layer consisted of finely woven linen or thin wool garments that sat directly against the skin. These undergarments were designed to wick moisture away from the body, while providing a smooth foundation for additional layers. Keeping skin dry was crucial. Wet skin in freezing temperatures could mean death within hours. Over this came the primary wool layer. Viking sheep produced remarkably dense, lanolin-rich wool that naturally repelled water while maintaining insulation properties even when damp. Women would spend countless hours spinning this wool into yarn, then weaving it into thick, tightly woven fabric. The natural oils in the wool created a barrier against moisture, while the dense weave trapped warm air close to the body. The outer layer was where Viking ingenuity truly shone. They used specially prepared animal hides, typically from seals, reindeer, or elk, that had been treated to remain flexible in extreme cold. These leather outer garments were often lined with fur, creating a dual barrier system. The leather blocked wind and repelled water, while the fur provided additional insulation and warmth. Vikings also developed sophisticated footwear systems. They would start with wool socks, add leather inner shoes, then wear heavy outer boots lined with fur or stuffed with dried grass for insulation. Some boots were designed with wooden soles that lifted feet off the frozen ground, preventing heat loss through conduction. Hand protection involved similar layering principles. Thin wool gloves served as the base layer, covered by thicker mittens made from animal hide. For extreme conditions, they would use oversized mittens lined with rabbit or fox fur, allowing fingers to move freely while maintaining shared warmth. The most sophisticated piece of Viking winter clothing was the cloak. These weren't simple blankets thrown over shoulders. They were carefully designed garments that could serve multiple functions. A well-made Viking cloak could function as a sleeping bag, a shelter, a sail for small boats, or even emergency insulation for an injured person. Chapter 3. The Science of Staying Fed. Winter survival for Vikings wasn't just about staying warm. It was about maintaining adequate nutrition when fresh food became impossible to obtain. They developed preservation and storage techniques that ensured communities could survive months without hunting or gathering. The foundation of Viking winter nutrition was preserved fish. Living in coastal regions and along major rivers, Vikings had access to abundant fish during warmer months, but they needed methods to make this protein last through winter. They developed several preservation techniques, each suited to different types of fish and storage conditions. Smoking was perhaps their most important preservation method. Vikings built specialized smoking houses where fish could be slowly dried over low fires for days or weeks. The combination of heat and smoke created chemical changes in the fish that prevented bacterial growth while concentrating flavors and nutrients. Properly smoked fish could last for months without spoiling. Salt curing was another crucial technique, though salt was a valuable commodity that had to be obtained through trade. Vikings would layer fish in wooden barrels with coarse salt, creating an environment where harmful bacteria couldn't survive. The salt drew moisture from the fish while infusing it with preservation property. For communities with limited access to salt, Vikings developed fermentation techniques that created natural preserve. Fish would be buried in specially prepared pits lined with birch bark, where controlled bacterial action would preserve the protein, while creating strong, nutrient-dense food that could sustain people through the harshest months. Meat preservation followed similar principles, that required different techniques. Large game animals killed in late fall would be butchered systematically, with every part of the animal preserved for different purposes. Fresh meat was eaten immediately, while less perishable cuts were smoked, salted or dried into jerky-like preparations. Vikings also preserved dairy products through fermentation. Milk was turned into various types of sour milk products that lasted longer than fresh dairy, while providing essential nutrients and probiotics that supported immune function during stressful winter months. Perhaps most importantly, Vikings understood the nutritional importance of organ meat during winter months when fresh vegetables were unavailable. Organ meats provided essential vitamins and minerals that prevented scurvy and other nutritional deficiency diseases. Liver, kidneys, and heart were considered delicacies precisely because of their nutritional density. One of the greatest challenges Vikings faced during winter wasn't physical, it was psychological. In the far north, winter days could be reduced to just a few hours of weak sunlight, with some regions experiencing months of near-total darkness. Vikings developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining mental health and community cohesion during these challenging periods. Storytelling became a crucial survival tool. During the long dark hours, communities would gather around central fires while skilled storytellers would recite epic tales, historical accounts, and mythological stories that could last for hours. These weren't just entertainment. They were psychological anchors that maintained cultural identity and provided mental stimulation during months of physical inactivity. The tradition of saga telling served multiple purposes. Stories preserved historical knowledge and cultural values while also providing mental exercise that kept minds sharp during periods of limited sensory input. The rhythmic, repetitive nature of traditional storytelling also had meditative qualities that reduced stress and anxiety. Vikings also developed sophisticated craft traditions that provided meaningful activity during winter months. Wood carving, metalwork, textile production, and tool making weren't just practical necessities. They were therapeutic activities that provided sense of accomplishment and progress during otherwise static months. Music played an important role in Viking winter psychology. Simple instruments like flutes, drums, and stringed instruments provided both entertainment and emotional outlet. Group singing and musical participation created community bonds, while also providing physical activity that helped maintain health. Religious and spiritual practices intensified during winter months. Vikings would hold extended ceremonies, make offerings to gods associated with survival and renewal, and engage in ritual activities that reinforced community bonds, while providing psychological comfort during uncertain times. The concept of hygge, though the word itself is Danish, reflects psychological strategies that Vikings pioneered, creating warm, comfortable, intimate spaces where small groups could gather, share food, engage in quiet activities, and simply enjoy each other's presence, became essential for mental health during dark months. Vikings also understood the importance of light in maintaining psychological health. They developed sophisticated oil lamps and candle-making techniques that could provide steady, warm light during dark months. These weren't just practical tools, they were psychological necessities that helped maintain circadian rhythms and provide focus points for social activity. Chapter 5: Water, Warmth, and Waste Management. Surviving Viking winters required solving basic but critical problems around water, heat management, and sanitation. Challenges that could mean the difference between life and death for entire community. Water procurement during winter presented unique challenges. Surface water would freeze solid for months, making traditional sources unavailable. Vikings developed several strategies for ensuring adequate water supplies throughout winter months. Ice harvesting became a sophisticated practice. Vikings would identify clean water sources during autumn, then return during early winter to harvest large blocks of ice that could be stored in insulated ice houses. These structures, built partially underground and insulated with straw and sawdust, could preserve ice well into spring months. Snow melting was another water source, but Vikings learned it required careful technique. Fresh snow contained significant amounts of air, meaning large quantities of snow were needed to produce relatively small amounts of water. They developed efficient melting techniques, using heated stones or metal containers that maximized water yield while conserving precious fuel. Vikings also learned to identify and access natural springs that remained unfrozen, even in extreme cold. These springs, often heated by geothermal activity or protected by underground flow, provided reliable water sources throughout winter. Knowledge of spring locations was carefully preserved and passed down through generations. Heat management within longhouses required constant tension and sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics. Vikings learned to bank fires carefully, using techniques that allowed coals to remain active overnight while minimizing fuel consumption. They developed specific wood-burning techniques that maximized heat output while minimizing smoke production. Fuel conservation was crucial for winter survival. Vikings would prepare extensive fuel supplies during autumn, including not just firewood but also dried peat, animal dung, and other combustible materials. They learned which materials burned hottest, which burned longest, and which produced the least smoke for indoor use. Waste management in confined winter spaces presented serious health challenges. Vikings developed sophisticated composting systems that turned human and animal waste into valuable fertilizer, while minimizing odor and health risks. These systems often involved layering waste with ash, straw, and other organic materials that accelerated decomposition while controlling smells. Indoor air quality was another crucial concern, with families confined in sealed spaces for months. Maintaining breathable air required careful attention to ventilation systems that provided fresh air without losing precious heat. Vikings designed adjustable air vents that could be opened or closed depending on weather conditions and indoor air quality. Viking winter survival was never an individual endeavor. It required sophisticated community cooperation and resource-sharing systems that ensured entire settlements could survive together or perish together. The concept of communal food storage was fundamental to Viking winter strategy. Individual families would contribute surplus food to community stores during autumn, creating shared reserves that could sustain everyone during the hardest months. These weren't just practical arrangements, they were social contracts that bound communities together through reciprocal obligation. Skill sharing became crucial during winter months, when communities were largely isolated from outside contact. Each person's specialized knowledge, whether in food preservation, craft production, medical care, or storytelling, became community property that benefited everyone's survival chances. Vikings developed sophisticated rotation systems for essential winter tasks. Maintaining fires, preparing food, caring for animals, and monitoring community health required constant attention. Rather than exhausting individuals, communities would rotate responsibilities, ensuring crucial tasks were always covered while distributing the workload equitably. Tool and resource sharing eliminated duplicate investments, while ensuring everyone had access to necessary equipment. Specialized tools for food processing, textile production, metalwork, and other essential activities were owned collectively and shared according to need and ability. Childcare became a community responsibility during winter months. With limited space and resources, caring for children required coordinated effort from all adults. This system ensured children received adequate attention and education while allowing parents to focus on essential survival tasks. Elder care followed similar principles. Older community members who could no longer perform physically demanding tasks were cared for collectively, while their knowledge and experience continued to benefit the entire community. Elders often served as teachers, storytellers, and keepers of essential cultural knowledge. Medical care during winter required community cooperation, since individual families rarely had sufficient resources to treat serious injuries or illnesses. Communities would pool medical knowledge, supplies, and caregiving responsibilities to ensure sick or injured members received adequate care. Vikings also developed systems for managing interpersonal conflicts that could become dangerous when people were confined together for months. They created formal and informal mechanisms for resolving disputes, maintaining social harmony, and preventing the kind of conflicts that could fracture community cohesion when survival depended on cooperation. Chapter 7. Spiritual and mental resilience. The psychological challenges of Viking winters required more than practical solutions. They demanded spiritual and mental frameworks that could sustain hope and purpose through months of hardship and uncertainty. Viking cosmology provided powerful mental models for understanding winter's place in the natural cycle. They viewed winter not as punishment or accident, but as necessary part of eternal cycles of death and renewal. This perspective helped communities maintain long-term thinking, even during immediate hardship. The concept of werd, roughly translated as fate or destiny, provided psychological framework for accepting circumstances beyond individual control, while maintaining agency over personal responses to those circumstances. This philosophy helped Vikings maintain psychological equilibrium during periods of extreme stress. Ritual practices intensified during winter months, providing structure and meaning to days that might otherwise feel empty or purposeless. Daily, weekly, and seasonal ceremonies created rhythm and anticipation that helped people psychologically navigate long periods of waiting and endurance. Vikings developed sophisticated meditation and mental discipline practices that helped individuals maintain psychological health during stressful periods. These practices often involved controlled breathing, repetitive movements, or focused attention exercises that reduced anxiety while maintaining mental clarity. Dream interpretation and visionary practices became more important during winter months, when communities had limited external stimulation. Vikings developed rich traditions around understanding and sharing dreams, visions, and altered states of consciousness that provided psychological outlets and community bonding opportunities. The practice of cider, a form of Norse magic and spiritual practice, often involved techniques that modern psychology would recognize as therapeutic. Practitioners would enter trance states, engage in rhythmic activities, and facilitate emotional expression that helped individuals and communities process stress and trauma. Vikings also understood the psychological importance of maintaining connection with the natural world, even during winter's harshest period. They developed practices for observing and interacting with winter landscapes, animal behavior, and seasonal changes that maintained sense of connection with larger natural cycles. Physical practices like wrestling, games of strength, and competitive activities provided outlets for physical energy while also serving psychological function. These activities maintained social hierarchies, provided entertainment, and allowed individuals to demonstrate competence and value to their community. Successful Viking winter survival began months before the first snow fell. They understood that winter survival required year-round preparation cycles that took advantage of seasonal opportunities and natural rhythms. Spring preparation began as soon as weather allowed outdoor activity. Vikings would assess winter damage to buildings, tools, and equipment, then begin repair and replacement projects that would ensure everything was ready for the following winter. This period also involved planning food production and preservation activities for the coming year. Summer months were intensive periods of resource gathering and processing. Vikings would harvest building materials, gather fuel supplies, hunt and fish intensively, and begin early stages of food preservation. They understood that summer abundance had to be captured and stored to ensure winter survival. Autumn was the critical preparation period when most winter survival activities reached peak intensity. This was when final food preservation occurred, when buildings received final weatherproofing, when fuel supplies were completed, and when communities made final assessments of their readiness for winter isolation. Vikings developed sophisticated forecasting abilities that allowed them to predict winter severity and adjust preparation activities accordingly. They observed animal behavior, weather patterns, plant cycles, and other natural indicators that provided advance warning of harsh winter. Tool and equipment maintenance followed seasonal cycles that ensured everything was in optimal condition when it was needed most. Vikings would systematically repair, sharpen, and replace tools during periods when they weren't needed for critical survival activity. Clothing production followed similar seasonal rhythms. Vikings would shear sheep, process wool, tan hides, and produce textiles during warmer months when these activities could be performed outdoors or in well-ventilated spaces. Social preparation was equally important. Communities would resolve conflicts, solidify alliances, arrange marriages, and strengthen social bonds during autumn months, ensuring that social harmony was established before winter confinement began. Knowledge transfer intensified during preparation periods. Older community members would intensify teaching activities, ensuring that essential survival knowledge was passed to younger generations before winter isolation began. Chapter 9: Innovation and Adaptation. Vikings weren't simply following ancient traditions. They were constant innovators who adapted their survival strategies based on new experiences, changing conditions, and creative problem solving. They developed regional variations in survival techniques that reflected local conditions and available resources. Coastal Vikings developed different strategies than inland Vikings, while those living in extreme northern regions created techniques that differed from those used in milder climate. Trade relationships allowed Vikings to incorporate new materials and techniques into their survival system. They adopted preservation methods from other cultures, integrated new materials like silk and exotic spices into their winter preparations, and learned new building techniques from cultures they encountered. Tool innovation was constant as Vikings refined and improved equipment for winter survival. They developed specialized knives for food processing, improved textile production equipment, created more efficient heating and cooking systems, and constantly refined building tech. Vikings also adapted their survival strategies based on changing environmental conditions. During particularly harsh periods, they would modify building techniques, alter food preservation methods, and develop new strategies for extreme conditions. Medical knowledge evolved as Vikings learned from experience, treating winter-related health problems. They developed increasingly sophisticated understanding of nutrition, injury treatment, and disease prevention that improved survival rates over time. Vikings were early adopters of new agricultural techniques that increased food production and improved storage capabilities. They experimented with new crops, developed improved cultivation methods, and created more effective food preservation technology. Social innovations were equally important. Vikings refined their community organization systems, developed new methods for resolving conflicts, and created increasingly effective systems for resource sharing and cooperation. The Viking approach to winter survival offers timeless lessons that remain relevant for modern survival situations, emergency preparedness, and understanding human resilience under extreme conditions. Their systematic approach to preparation demonstrates the importance of long-term thinking and proactive planning. Vikings understood that survival couldn't be improvised. It required methodical preparation that began months in advance and continued year-round. The emphasis on community cooperation shows how individual survival often depends on group cohesion and mutual support. Viking communities succeeded because they developed systems that ensured everyone's survival needs were met through collective effort and resource sharing. Their integration of practical and psychological survival strategies recognizes that human survival involves more than meeting basic physical needs. Vikings understood that maintaining mental health, social bonds, and spiritual resilience were equally important for long-term survival. The Viking approach to innovation and adaptation demonstrates the importance of flexibility and creative problem-solving in survival situations. They combined respect for traditional knowledge with willingness to experiment and adapt based on new circumstances. Their understanding of natural cycles and environmental awareness shows how successful survival requires deep knowledge of local conditions and natural patterns. Vikings succeeded because they understood their environment intimately and worked with natural systems rather than against them. The emphasis on skill development and knowledge preservation demonstrates how survival capabilities must be maintained and transmitted across generations. Viking communities invested heavily in education and knowledge transfer that ensured essential survival knowledge wasn't lost. Their integrated approach to technology, community organization, and environmental management shows how successful survival systems address multiple challenges simultaneously, rather than focusing on individual problems in isolation. Closing last 30 seconds. As the long winter nights of medieval Scandinavia fade into history, we're left with profound lessons about human resilience, community cooperation, and the patient wisdom required to survive life's harshest season. The Vikings didn't just endure their brutal winters, they created rich, meaningful lives within them, finding warmth in community, purpose in preparation, and hope in the eternal cycle of seasons. Imagine waking up before dawn, not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of roosters and the urgent need to tend to animals that could mean the difference between eating and starving. This was the reality for over 90% of people living in medieval Europe. No smartphones, no coffee shops, no weekends off, just an endless cycle of back-breaking work, survival and submission to lords who controlled every aspect of their existence. Tonight, we're going to explore the surprisingly complex and often harsh world of medieval peasants, their daily routines, their struggles, their small victories, and the intricate web of obligations that bound them to the land and their feudal masters. Introduction and setup. 15 to 60 seconds. The medieval period, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th centuries, was defined by the feudal system, a rigid hierarchy, where peasants formed the vast foundation supporting the entire social structure. These weren't just simple farmers, as we might imagine them today. They were complex individuals navigating an intricate system of laws, customs, and survival strategies that had been refined over generations. To understand a medieval peasant's life, we need to first understand their place in society. They were not slaves, exactly, but they weren't free either. Most were what we call serfs or villeins, bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without their lord's permission, and subject to a complex web of obligations and rights that governed everything from when they could marry to how much grain they could keep from their own harvest. The peasants' world was usually encompassing no more than a few miles from their birthplace. Yet within this small world existed a rich tapestry of relationships, traditions, and daily challenges that required remarkable resilience and ingenuity to navigate. The peasant's day begins 60 to 180 seconds. A typical day for a medieval peasant began well before sunrise. There were no glass windows in their homes, so the first light filtering through shutters or simple openings served as their alarm clock. But more often it was necessity that woke them. Animals needed feeding, fires needed stoking, and the day's work couldn't wait for comfort. The peasant's home was modest, to say the least. Most lived in what we'd call a cot, a single-room structure made of wood, wattle, and daub, or stone, if they were fortunate. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw. The roof was typically thatch, layers of straw, reed, or other plant material that provided reasonable protection from the elements, though leaks were common and repairs were constant. This single room served multiple purposes. It was bedroom, kitchen, workshop, and sometimes it even housed animals during harsh weather. Privacy was virtually non-existent. Families of 6, 8, or even 10 people might share this space, sleeping on straw mattresses or simple beds made of rope and wood. Personal possessions were minimal. A few tools, some cooking implements, perhaps a change of clothes, and little else. The peasant would rise and immediately attend to the animals. Chickens needed to be let out and fed. Pigs, if they owned any, required attention. A cow or goat, if they were prosperous enough to own one, needed milking. These animals weren't pets, they were survival. Each egg, each cup of milk, each piglet born was the difference between adequate nutrition and hunger. Water had to be fetched from the village well or nearby stream. This wasn't a quick turn of a faucet. It meant carrying heavy buckets, often multiple trips, to meet the day's needs for drinking, cooking, and washing. The quality of this water was questionable at best, which is why ale and weak beer were the preferred beverages for both adults and children. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was simple and often sparse. Bread was the staple, but not the fluffy white bread we know today. Medieval peasant bread was dark, dense, and often gritty, made from whatever grains were available. Barley, oats, and rye were more common than wheat for peasants. The bread might be days old, hard enough to break teeth, and often needed to be softened in ale or thin porridge. Porridge made from oats, barley, or other grains was common. It was filling, used ingredients they could grow themselves, and could be stretched with water when times were lean. A bit of milk from their cow or goat, if they had one, made it more palatable. Cheese, when available, was a luxury that provided essential protein and could be stored for lean times. After this meagre meal, the peasant would prepare for the day's work. Tools needed to be gathered and checked. A scythe for cutting grain, a hoe for tending crops, an axe for cutting wood. Each tool was precious and irreplaceable. There were no hardware stores, no mass production. These implements were often handmade by the village blacksmith and had to last for years, sometimes decades. The peasants' clothing was practical above all else. Men wore simple tunics, often made of rough wool or linen, over brays, loose underwear that resembled shorts. Over this they might wear a cloak or mantle for warmth. Women wore long dresses, also of rough wool or linen, often with an apron to protect the dress during work. Both men and women wore simple shoes, often made of leather, though going barefoot was common during warmer months. Clothing was expensive and time-consuming to make. A peasant might own only 2 or 3 garments, wearing them until they literally fell apart. Repairs were constant patches upon patches, careful mending of tears, and creative solutions to extend the life of each piece of clothing. The working day, agricultural labor, 240 or 20 seconds. The bulk of a peasant's day was spent in agricultural labor, but this wasn't simply farming as we might understand it today. It was a complex system of obligations and survival strategies that varied dramatically with the seasons. A peasant typically worked several different plots of land. First, there was their own small holding, perhaps an acre or 2 around their home, where they could grow vegetables, keep animals, and produce what they needed for survival. This was their most important land, the difference between life and death during harsh winters. But they also worked the lord's domain, the land directly controlled by the feudal lord. This was their primary obligation, their rent, if you will, paid in labor rather than money. 2 or 3 days each week, sometimes more during harvest time, belonged entirely to the lord. The peasant had to provide their own tools, their own labor, and work the lord's land as diligently as their own. Additionally, peasants worked strips of land in the common field. The medieval agricultural system divided arable land into large fields, which were then subdivided into narrow strips. Each peasant family would hold several of these strips, scattered throughout different fields. This system ensured that everyone had access to both good and poor soil, sharing the risks and benefits of different locations. The work itself was backbreaking. Ploughing was done with simple wooden ploughs, often pulled by oxen if the peasant could afford to share in the village's oxen, or by the peasant themselves if they couldn't. The soil had to be broken, stones removed, furrows made straight, and this was done by hand, with simple tools, in all weather conditions. Sowing seeds was meticulous work. Each seed was precious, there was no margin for waste. Seeds were scattered by hand, with the peasant walking slowly across the field, ensuring even distribution. Too thick, and the plants would compete and produce poorly. Too thin, and precious land would be wasted. Weeding was constant throughout the growing season. Without herbicides or modern farming techniques, weeds threatened to choke out crops. Hours were spent bent over, carefully removing unwanted plants by hand, protecting the vulnerable food crops that would determine whether the family ate well or poorly in the coming year. Harvesting was the most critical time of the year. The entire community would mobilize for harvest time. Men, women and children all participated. Grain was cut with sickles, curved blades that required the harvester to bend over and cut each stalk individually. This was exhausting work, often done from dawn to dusk, with the constant pressure of weather threatening to ruin the crop. After cutting, the grain had to be gathered, bundled into sheaves, and transported to the threshing floor. Threshing, separating the grain from the stalks, was done by beating the sheaves with flails, or having animals trample the grain. This too was labor-intensive, time-sensitive work. But the peasants' obligations didn't end there. A portion of everything they produced belonged to Lord. Typically, every 10th sheaf of grain, every 10th pig, every 10th anything went to the Lord's storehouse. This was called the tithe, and it was collected rigorously. The peasant had to transport their share of the harvest to the Lord's granary, using their own time and energy to deliver the fruits of their labor to someone else. Daily obligations and the feudal system, 40-20, 540 seconds. The feudal system wasn't just about agricultural work, it was a comprehensive system of mutual obligations and rights that governed every aspect of peasant life. Understanding these obligations helps us grasp just how constrained and controlled peasant life really was. Beyond working the Lord's land, peasants owed various other services. They might be required to repair the Lord's buildings, maintain roads and bridges, dig ditches, or perform any number of tasks that benefited the manor. These obligations were called boon work and could be called upon at any time, disrupting the peasants' own agricultural schedule. Peasants also owed military service, though this was typically limited and specific. They might be required to serve as foot soldiers in times of conflict, or to provide provisions and support for the lord's military campaign. While they weren't professional warriors, they were expected to contribute to the defense of the manor and the realm. One of the most restrictive aspects of peasant life was the control over movement and major life decisions. A serf couldn't leave the manor without permission. They couldn't marry without the lord's consent, often requiring payment of a fee called merchet. When a peasant died, their family often had to pay harriet, typically their best animal or most valuable possession, to the lord as a death duty. The lord also controlled access to essential services. Peasants were typically required to use the lord's mill to grind their grain, paying a fee for this privilege. They had to use the lord's bakery to bake their bread, the lord's brewery to make ale, and the lord's forge for metalwork. These weren't conveniences, they were monopolies that ensured the lord profited from every aspect of peasant life. Justice was administered by the lord, or his representatives. Peasants had their own courts, called manor courts, where minor disputes were settled and local laws but serious crimes, and any dispute involving the lord, were handled by higher courts where peasants had little recourse and few rights. The church also played a significant role in peasant obligations. Beyond the agricultural tithe to the lord, peasants owed a religious tithe to the church, typically 1/10 of their remaining produce. They were expected to attend church services, participate in religious festivals, and contribute labor to church construction and maintenance. These overlapping obligations meant that peasants retained only a fraction of what they produced. After paying the lord, the church, and setting aside seed for next year's planting, a peasant family might keep only 30 to 40% of their agricultural output. This narrow margin meant that any disruption, poor weather, disease, war, or increased demands from the lord could quickly lead to starvation. Food security was the constant preoccupation of medieval peasants. Their diet was monotonous, often inadequate, and subject to dramatic seasonal variations that could mean the difference between life and death. Grain formed the foundation of the peasant diet. Bread, porridge, and ale, all made from barley, oats, rye, or wheat, provided the majority of their calories. A peasant might consume 2 to 3 pounds of bread per day when it was available. This bread was their primary source of energy, and its availability determined their survival. Vegetables were cultivated in small gardens near the peasant's home. Onions, leeks, cabbage, and peas were common. These were often grown in small plots, tended carefully, and preserved through the winter months. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots could be stored in root cellars, providing essential nutrition during the lean months between harvest and spring planting. Protein was scarce and precious. Most peasants rarely ate meat, except during special occasions or when an animal died. Chickens were kept primarily for eggs rather than meat. A pig, if they owned one, might be slaughtered once a year, typically in the fall when cold weather allowed for preservation. Every part of the animal was used. Nothing was wasted. Fish provided protein for those living near rivers or the sea. Peasants developed sophisticated methods for catching and preserving fish. Salting, smoking, and drying allowed fish to be stored for months, providing essential protein during winter months when other sources were unavailable. Dairy products, when available, were crucial for nutrition. Milk from cows or goats was often turned into cheese, which could be stored longer than fresh milk. Butter was a luxury, but when available, provided essential fats that were otherwise scarce in the peasant diet. Preservation was a critical survival skill. Without refrigeration, peasants had to master various techniques for storing food through the winter. Salting meat and fish, drying vegetables, storing grain in carefully constructed granaries, and managing resources to last through the lean months required planning, skill, and luck. The seasonal cycle of feast and famine was a constant reality. Harvest time brought abundance, relatively speaking. Peasants would eat better in the fall than at any other time of the year, but by late winter and early spring, stored food would be running low. This period, sometimes called the hunger gap, was when starvation was most likely. Peasants developed various strategies to stretch their food supplies. They might mix sawdust or ground acorns into their bread to make it go further. They foraged for wild plants, nuts, and berries to supplement their diet. They knew which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, and which could provide nutrition when cultivated food was scarce. Cooking methods were simple but effective. Most peasants had only one pot, used for everything from porridge to stew. Food was boiled, roasted over an open fire, or baked in communal ovens. Flavoring was minimal, salt was expensive, spices were luxuries available only to the wealthy. Meals were functional rather than pleasurable. Water quality was a constant concern. Peasants understood that water from certain sources could make them sick, though they didn't understand the concept of bacteria or waterborne diseases. They preferred ale or weak beer, which was safer than water and provided some nutrition. Even children drank ale regularly, as it was often the safest available beverage. Family life and social relationships, 667-82 seconds. Despite the harsh conditions and constant work, medieval peasants maintained complex family and social relationships that provided support, meaning and structure to their lives. The peasant family was both an economic unit and a social institution. Marriage was often as much an economic arrangement as a romantic one. Families needed to consider land holdings, work capacity, and survival needs when arranging marriage. A strong partner could mean the difference between prosperity and destitution. Children were economic assets from a young age. By the time they were 6 or 7, children were contributing to the family's survival. They helped with simple tasks: gathering eggs, feeding chickens, weeding gardens, carrying water. As they grew older, their responsibilities increased. Boys learned agricultural techniques from their fathers, while girls learned household management from their mother. Education, as we understand it, was virtually non-existent for peasant children. Reading and writing were skills reserved for the clergy and nobility. Peasant children learned through observation and practice. They learned to judge weather patterns, understand soil conditions, recognize plant diseases, and master the hundreds of small skills necessary for survival. The peasant community was tightly knit by necessity. Neighbors depended on each other for survival during difficult times. They shared resources during crises, helped with major tasks like harvest or house construction, and provided support during illness or family emergencies. Village life centered around shared spaces and activity. The village green was where community meetings were held, where children played, and where various communal activities took place. The church was not just a religious center, but a social hub where the community gathered for worship, festivals, and important announcements. Seasonal festivals and religious holidays provided breaks from the monotony of work and opportunities for community bonding. Harvest festivals celebrated successful crops and gave thanks for survival through another year. Religious holidays marked important points in the calendar and provided structure to the year. Marriage customs were elaborate and important community events. Despite their poverty, peasants found ways to celebrate weddings with feasts, dancing, and community participation. These celebrations strengthened social bonds and marked important transitions in community life. Death was a frequent visitor to medieval peasant communities. High infant mortality, disease, accidents, and malnutrition meant that families regularly faced. Community support during times of grief was essential, and elaborate customs developed around mourning and burial. Women's roles in peasant society were complex and vital. While they had fewer legal rights than men, they were essential partners in the family's survival strategy. Women managed households, raised children, tended gardens, preserved food, and often worked in the fields alongside men. They possessed knowledge of herbs and medicines, served as midwives, and maintained the social fabric of the community. The elderly were both respected for their wisdom and seen as economic burdens when they could no longer work. Families cared for aging relatives as a matter of obligation and affection, but this care came at a cost in a society where every person needed to contribute to survival. Social mobility was extremely limited. A peasant born into a peasant family would almost certainly die as a peasant. However, within the peasant class, there were distinctions. Some peasants owned more land, had better tools, or possessed special skills that made them more prosperous than their neighbors. The life of a medieval peasant was governed by the rhythm of the seasons more completely than we can easily imagine today. Each season brought its own challenges, opportunities, and required activities that determined whether the family would survive and prosper or struggle and starve. Spring was a time of hope and frantic activity. As the weather warmed and the days lengthened, peasants emerged from the relative inactivity of winter into the critical planting season. Fields had to be prepared, ploughed, and this was backbreaking work, often done in wet, cold conditions, but it was essential. The quality of spring planting determined the success of the entire year. Spring also brought new life to the peasants' animals. Calves, piglets, and chicks were born, providing hope for increased food production and potential trade goods. But it also brought new responsibilities. Young animals required constant care and protection from predators and disease. The spring months were often the most difficult for food supplies. Stored grain from the previous harvest was running low, but new crops wouldn't be ready for months. This hunger gap was when malnutrition was most common, when families made difficult decisions about how to stretch their remaining food supplies. Summer was the season of growth and intensive labor. Crops required constant weeding, watering in dry periods, protecting from pests and diseases. The peasant's schedule was determined by the needs of growing plants. There were no days off, no vacation time. Every day was critical to ensuring a successful harvest. Summer also brought opportunities for additional food gathering. Wild berries, nuts, and edible plants could supplement the family's diet. Rivers and streams provided fish, while forests offered opportunities for hunting small game, though this was often restricted by the lord's hunting right. The summer months required preparation for winter. Firewood had to be cut and stacked. Buildings needed repair before harsh weather arrived. Tools required maintenance and replacement. The peasant family spent summer preparing for survival through the coming winter. Autumn was harvest's the most critical period of the entire year. Everything the family had worked for through the spring and summer came down to these few weeks. Weather during harvest could mean the difference between abundance and starvation. Too much rain could rot crops in the field. Drought could reduce yield. Early frost could destroy crops before they could be harvested. The entire community mobilized for harvest. Men, women, and children worked from dawn to dusk, cutting grain, gathering crops, and processing the harvest. This was exhausting work, but it was also a time of community cooperation and shared purpose. After the harvest came the accounting, determining how much grain would go to the Lord, how much to the church, how much needed to be saved for seed, and how much the family could keep for food. This calculation determined the family's prospects for the coming year. Winter was a time of relative rest, but also of constant vigilance. With shorter days and harsh weather limiting outdoor work, peasants focused on indoor activity, maintaining tools, processing food, making and repairing clothes, and managing their carefully hoarded resources. Winter was also the most dangerous season. Cold weather, limited food supplies, and increased susceptibility to disease made winter the time when death was most likely. Families huddled together for warmth, conserved fuel, and tried to make their stored food last until spring planting. The annual cycle wasn't just about survival, it was about careful resource management over time. Peasants had to think ahead, planning not just for the next season, but for multiple years. They had to balance immediate needs with long-term survival, making decisions that would affect their family's prospects for years to come. Health, medicine, and survival. 900 in 20 seconds. Healthcare for medieval peasants was a complex mixture of practical knowledge, religious faith, and simple remedies passed down through generations. Without modern medicine, peasants faced constant threats to their health and developed sophisticated, if limited, strategies for maintaining wellness and treating illness. Disease was a constant companion in peasant life. Poor nutrition, inadequate sanitation, and crowded living conditions created ideal circumstances for the spread of illness. Common ailments included dysentery, fever, respiratory infections, and various skin conditions. More serious diseases like tuberculosis, smallpox, and bubonic plague could devastate entire communities. The peasants' understanding of health was based on observation and experience rather than scientific knowledge. They recognized that certain foods, herbs, and practices could promote health or treat illness, even if they didn't understand why. This folk medicine was surprisingly effective for some conditions, though completely inadequate for serious diseases. Women often served as the primary healthcare providers in peasant communities. They possessed knowledge of medicinal herbs, understood basic wound care, and served as midwives during childbirth. This knowledge was passed from mother to daughter, creating a network of informal healthcare that was essential for community survival. Herbal remedies were the foundation of peasant medicine. Peasants knew which plants could reduce fever, ease pain, promote healing, or treat specific ailments. Gardens often included medicinal herbs alongside food crops. Willow bark for pain relief, chamomile for digestive issues, and various other plants were cultivated and used regularly. Prayer and religious ritual were considered as important as physical remedy. Peasants believed that illness could be caused by sin, divine punishment, or supernatural forces. Religious remedies, prayer, pilgrimage, relics, and blessings were often the first response to serious illness. Childbirth was particularly dangerous for peasant women. Without proper medical care, complications during delivery could be fatal for both mother and child. Infant mortality was extremely high, perhaps as many as half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Families had to be prepared for the loss of children, even as they invested emotionally in their care and upbringing. Accidents were common in peasant life. Working with sharp tools, large animals, and heavy equipment created constant risk. A serious injury could be catastrophic for a peasant family, removing their primary source of labor and income. Simple cuts could become infected and life-threatening without proper treatment. Dental care was primitive or non-existent. Tooth decay and dental pain were common problems that peasants had to endure with minimal relief. The loss of teeth affected nutrition and overall health, creating a downward spiral that was difficult to escape. Mental health, while not understood in modern terms, was recognized as a real concern. The constant stress of survival, frequent losses, and harsh living conditions took a psychological toll on peasant communities. Community support, religious faith, and seasonal festivals provided some relief from the psychological pressures of peasant life. Hygiene was understood to be important for health, though the means for maintaining cleanliness were limited. Peasants bathed infrequently, partly due to cultural attitudes, but mostly due to practical limitations. Water had to be heated over fires, soap was expensive or non-existent, and privacy was limited. However, peasants did understand the importance of clean clothes and bedding when resources allowed. Life expectancy for peasants was significantly lower than modern standards. Those who survived childhood might live to their 40s or 50s, but reaching old age was unusual. The combination of hard work, poor nutrition, inadequate healthcare, and constant exposure to disease created conditions where early death was common. Despite these challenges, many peasants developed remarkable resilience and adaptability. They learned to work despite chronic pain, to function with limited nutrition, and to maintain hope despite frequent setbacks. This resilience was perhaps their greatest survival tool. The medieval peasants' relationship with tools and technology was intimate and essential. Every implement was precious, often handmade, and required careful maintenance to last for years or even decades. Understanding their tools helps us appreciate both the limitations and the ingenuity of peasant life. The most important tool for any peasant was the plough. For most peasants, this was a simple wooden implement, sometimes reinforced with iron if they were fortunate. The plough had to break through soil that had been compacted by weather and animals, turn over the earth to prepare it for planting, and create furrows for seeds. This required significant physical strength and skill to operate effective. Oxen or horses were used to pull ploughs when available, but many peasants couldn't afford draft animals. In such cases, the peasant might harness themselves to the plough or work cooperatively with neighbors to share animal power. The efficiency of ploughing determined how much land could be cultivated, and therefore how much food could be produced. Hand tools were equally important and more commonly owned. The hoe was used for breaking up soil, weeding, and cultivating crops. Scythes and sickles were essential for harvesting grain. The scythe, with its long curved blade, allowed for faster cutting of grain, while the smaller sickle required more labor but gave greater precision. Axes were multi-purpose tools used for cutting firewood, clearing land, and construction. A good axe was valuable property, carefully maintained, and often passed down through generations. The quality of the axe blade determined its effectiveness and longevity. Household implements were simple but functional. Most peasant families owned a single iron pot for cooking. This pot served multiple purposes: boiling grains for porridge, cooking stews, heating water, and even serving as a container for other activities. Clay or wooden bowls, wooden spoons, and simple knives completed the kitchen equipment. Textile production required specialized tools that were often shared within the community. Spinning wheels for making thread, looms for weaving cloth, and various implements for processing flax and wool were expensive and complex. Many peasants couldn't afford their own textile equipment, instead sharing or bartering for access to these tools. The blacksmith was a crucial figure in peasant communities, as metal tools couldn't be made or repaired by individual peasants. The blacksmith created and maintained the iron implements that made agricultural work possible. Visits to the blacksmith were significant events, often requiring barter of grain or other goods in exchange for metalwork. Storage was a constant challenge that required ingenious solutions. Grain had to be stored in ways that protected it from moisture, rodents, and insects. Simple wooden chests, clay pots, and woven baskets served as storage containers. Root cellars dug into the ground provided cool storage for vegetables through the winter months. Water management required various implements and techniques: wooden buckets for carrying water, simple pumps or wells for accessing groundwater, and channels or ditches for irrigation were all part of the peasants' technological toolkit. Managing water effectively could mean the difference between successful crops and failure. Measurement and calculation were done with simple but effective tools. Peasants used their own bodies as measuring devices: a foot, a pace, an arm's length. They understood seasonal changes and weather patterns through careful observation rather than scientific instruments. This practical knowledge was often more accurate than might be expected. Transportation was limited but important. Most peasants owned a simple cart or wagon, often shared with neighbors. These vehicles were used for transporting grain to market, moving harvested crops, and occasionally for travel. The condition of roads and paths determined the effectiveness of these simple transport methods. Lighting was provided by simple oil lamps, candles made from animal fat, or pine torches. These provided limited illumination and were expensive to maintain. Most peasant activities were scheduled around natural light, with work beginning at dawn and ending at dusk. The peasants' relationship with their tools was characterized by careful maintenance and creative adaptation. Tools were repaired repeatedly, modified for specific tasks, and used in ways that maximized their utility. Nothing was disposable. Everything had to last, and ingenuity was required to make simple implements serve multiple purposes. Conclusion: the rhythm of medieval peasant life, 1140, told 100 seconds. As we reach the end of our journey into the world of medieval peasants, it's worth reflecting on the remarkable resilience and complexity of these lives that sustained European civilization for centuries. The medieval peasant lived in a world we can barely imagine, where survival was never guaranteed, where the rhythm of life was dictated by seasons and feudal obligations, where community bonds were essential for existence, and where every day required careful balance between immediate needs and long-term survival. Their lives were constrained by circumstances we would find intolerable, bound to the land, subject to the whims of lords and weather, with limited choices and constant labor. Yet within these constraints, they created rich communities, developed sophisticated survival strategies, and maintained the agricultural foundation that supported medieval civilization. The peasant's day began before dawn and ended after dusk, filled with tasks that were essential for survival. From tending animals and working fields to managing households and maintaining tools, every activity served a purpose in the larger strategy of making it through another year. Their relationship with the natural world was intimate. They understood weather patterns, soil conditions, plant diseases, and animal behavior in ways that modern people, separated from agricultural production, can hardly comprehend. This knowledge was literally a matter of life and death. The social bonds within peasant communities were stronger than those in our modern world, forged by shared struggle and mutual dependence. Neighbors weren't just people who lived near, they were essential partners in survival, sources of help during crisis, and the foundation of social stability. Despite the hardships, medieval peasants found ways to celebrate, to create meaning, to maintain hope, and to pass on their knowledge and values to the next generation. Their festivals, customs, and traditions provided structure and joy in lives that might otherwise have been overwhelmed by constant struggle. The legacy of medieval peasants is profound. Their agricultural innovations, their social structures, and their accumulated wisdom about living close to the land provided the foundation for later development. Many of our modern values, the importance of hard work, community cooperation, and resource conservation have roots in peasant culture. As you drift off to sleep tonight, comfortable in your warm bed, with food in your refrigerator and clean water at your fingertips, perhaps you can appreciate the remarkable journey that human civilization has taken since the time when most people lived as medieval peasants, when survival was the primary occupation, and when the simple luxury of a peaceful night's rest was earned through a lifetime of labor and carefully managed resources. The world of the medieval peasant reminds us that human resilience and adaptability are remarkable, that people can create meaning, community, and even moments of joy in the most challenging circumstances, and that the comfort and security we often take for granted represent the accumulated progress of countless generations who worked, struggled, and survived, so that we might have easier lives. Sleep well, knowing that the long journey from their world to ours has been one of gradual improvement, of increasing security, and of expanding possibilities for human flourishing.